Hello once again. Let me start today with a quote from Robert Louis Stevenson. He said, "Marriage is like life in this, that it is a field of battle and not a bed of roses." That's an interesting view. I think it was while I was studying a course on marriage and family way back around 1979 that I first came across the phrase conflict habituated relationship. And what this described was a marriage in which the husband and wife chose to remain together, and yet they were constantly fighting and arguing with each other. The old case of they couldn't live together peacefully, but then again they couldn't live apart either. And there may be a variety of reasons why some people put themselves in such a situation. It may be that yes, there is love, but there is also a clash of egos. It may be that both of them are dominant or what we call alpha personalities. It may be that both of them grew up in families where strife was a constant feature, and so to them that's a normal part of marriage. But the fact is that most of us would not like to stay in a relationship like that because it would mean constant misery. If we want to have happy, satisfying relationships, then we need to avoid a situation where both husband and wife are seeking to dominate one another. And we have something relating to this over in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, beginning in verse 21 and going right through to the end of that chapter. There is an old proverb that says, "What's good for the goose is good for the gander." Or another version, "What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander." And the idea is that both sides in a relationship should be treated well. Goose may be the general description of that species of bird, but also goose can mean the female of the species, whilst the word gander was the male of the species. And so applying that proverb to marriage, the idea is to look after the wife just as much as you would look after the husband. One should be treated as well as the other. And so it is here in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, that we have the idea of mutual responsibility for both husbands and for wives. Both sides contribute equally to the marriage. They should be equally caring to one another. Now, because of feminism and political correctness and a general ignorance of the Bible and even a skepticism towards the Bible, there are many who disregard Ephesians 5, who dismiss it. But if you take time to look at it properly, to look at it in an unbiased fashion, you'll see here that just as much is asked of husbands as is asked of wives. And I'm first going to look at this passage in regard to what it says to husbands. And note, first of all, verse 21. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. The idea of submitting to one another. It again is a mutual relationship, mutual responsibility, and furthermore it is done out of a deep respect for Jesus Christ. What is said here regarding wives and their responsibilities is also said to husbands in regard to their responsibilities. Both should care for the other. Our text is not a justification for male chauvinism or the oppression of wives. It is not that way at all. What does it say to husbands? Well, first of all, look at verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. The husband is to have a self-sacrificial love for his wife. First of all, here the word love, as is used several times through this passage, it comes from a Greek word and isn't simply talking about an emotional or a physical attraction based upon the appeal of the other person. Rather, it is a decision to do good for another person, to act for the benefit of another person. So a husband chooses to act for the benefit of his wife. And how far does that take him? It is self-sacrificial. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He subjected himself to scourging, in other words, to having his back lashed, to being pierced with nails, fixed to a cross or to a stake, being rejected by others, ridiculed by others. He went through all of that for the church, and he was self-sacrificial, and that's the way it should be with husbands as well. That we're willing to go to great lengths to do what we can to help our wives. And this helps in part to answer the antagonism that many women feel towards verse 22, and I'll come to that in a while. But just as the wives are asked to make a sacrifice in regard to their husbands, husbands are also being asked to make great sacrifices in regard to their wives. A husband who is intent on following Christ's example will think more of what he can do for his wife rather than thinking of what he wants his wife to do for him all of the time. You can hardly consider yourself a faithful Christian, a so-called good churchgoer, if you treat your wife as a slave and expect her to run after you all of the time. This is talking about husbands being willing to make a sacrifice for the good of their wives. And so there is this idea of unselfishness. And unselfishness comes out in a couple more verses here. First of all, verse 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And then verse 33, however, let each of you love his wife as himself. And that might sound a little bit egotistical there, but what it's saying is husbands should love their wives no less than they love their own selves. In other words, a husband should think no less of his wife's needs than he does of his own needs. His needs in the marriage don't come first, and his wife's needs don't come second. But rather, there's a consideration just as much for the needs of our wife as there is for our own needs. Indeed, rather than it being my needs versus her needs, it should be instead a case of our needs, because I should view my wife's needs as my needs. That comes out, if you look here at verse 31. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. See, it's not him plus her. The two are now one. That indicates the closeness of the relationship. And that verse 31 is actually a quote from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, from the time when marriage was established by God. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So he considers her needs as much as he considers his own needs. Thus, if you look here at, say, verse 28, 9, well, we'll start again at 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Christ looks after the church because the church is, in a sense, a part of him. And so it is with us, that our wives are part of ourselves. And therefore, to care for my wife is to care for myself. To care for myself is to care for my wife. She needs just as much care as I might desire for myself. So again, there's this idea of unselfishness. And then something else that we could add to this as well is the idea of ongoing devotion. Again, look at Ephesians 5 verse 31. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it says first of all here, and again this is quoting Genesis 2:24, a man shall leave his father and mother. Now that doesn't mean that you toss your parents aside. The Bible in many passages teaches ongoing care and respect for our parents, that we should respect them even when they are elderly. We should care for them even when they are elderly. Passages like 1 Timothy chapter 5 talk about that. But what it's saying is that with marriage, we move on to establish a new relationship with our wife, and our concerns are for her. And we should not allow our ongoing relationship with our parents to dominate our relationship with our wife. And that really raises a point for parents of married couples as well, that as the parents of a husband or a wife, we should not try to interfere with their marriage. We should not try to control their marriage. We should let them build their marriage and build their family. Now, we might be asked for advice or something at times, and yes, we do what we can to help, but we don't try to run things. The husband leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife. The Greek word there that is translated hold fast, in my version, I'm using the English Standard Version, the Greek word means to glue to adhere. In other words, to stick together. When I was a boy growing up in England, I used to make airfix kits, model aeroplanes. These were the sort that you glue together. And so, for instance, you might have two halves of a fuselage. And so you would put glue on one half and put them together, and the glue would dry, and now those two halves have become one. They're bound together. And that's the idea with marriage, that the husband holds fast to his wife. He doesn't toss her aside simply because he's found somebody else, or because he finds marriage inconvenient or something like that. He makes a lasting commitment to his wife. And the Hebrew word used in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 indicates the same thing. The Hebrew word there is defined as to cleave, to adhere, especially firmly, as if with glue, to be glued, hence to be attached to anyone, to be lovingly devoted. So there is a firm and there is a lasting devoted bond. The man has grown up with his family, his parents, but now he moves on and he forms a lasting relationship with his wife. And that relationship shouldn't be like the relationship in marriage that God condemned back in Malachi, the 2nd chapter. Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. And here God talks to his people who once again have drifted away from him. He says he no longer accepts or regards their offerings. And in verse 14 of Malachi 2, they say, well, why doesn't he? And here's the answer: because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. They had married their wives, they had made a commitment to them, but they had forgotten about that commitment and drifted away from them. Marriage should not be like that. It should be a situation where the two become one and there is a lasting bond between them. So those are some of the positive attitudes that husbands should have towards their wives. An unselfish, self-sacrificial attitude, a lasting bond, a commitment to their wives, and a care for their wives in terms of acting for their wives' benefit, which is what the word love meant. So what about wives? Well, this brings us to what for many is a very unpopular passage. Ephesians 5, and again I'll begin in verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Saviour. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. At the very least, for many, this is a controversial passage. Indeed, for many, it is a hated passage. I've read Ephesians 5:22 to 33 when I've been conducting weddings. I've explained the context, I've explained the mutual responsibilities, and even despite doing that, I've still had occasions in weddings where there would either be loud laughter concerning verses 22 to 24, and even hissing from women within the group. So a lot of wives in particular, a lot of women do not like this passage, but we really have to recognize what it's saying. It's reached the point where this passage and the idea behind it now is excluded from a lot of weddings. What does it mean to submit to your husband or to be subject? Well, we'll look up the meaning of the Greek word. Strong says it means to be under obedience, be in subjection to, submit self unto. Vine says to subject oneself, to obey, be subject to. Thayer says to subject oneself, to obey, to submit to one's control, to yield to one's admonition or advice. And the response of many women to this is, well, this turns wives into slaves who are at the mercy of their husbands and who must provide for every whim of their husbands. And I recognize that there are husbands who will treat their wives that way, and there are husbands who may well use verses 22 to 24 as a justification of their actions. But to interpret verses 22 to 24 in this manner ignores the entire context and uses these verses in a way that they're not meant to be understood. As we've already seen, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. So Christ is the role model. A husband should act towards his wife as Christ acts. And if his attitude and behavior is any less, then he is not fulfilling this verse, this passage. Husbands, as we've seen, should be self-sacrificial in their love, just as Christ was. Husbands should act for the good of their wives. That's the meaning, as I said, of the word love. Husbands should treat their wives with no less consideration than they would treat themselves. So verses 22 to 24 are not intended to turn wives into slaves. It does not support the idea of husbands being chauvinistic, misogynistic dictators or slave drivers. That is not in this passage. I've mentioned this a number of times over the years, but quite a few years ago I was doing a course for counsellors, and I was attending a workshop one day dealing with family and marriage counselling. This was not a religious course. It was not giving religious instruction. The trainer was not religious, and indeed, from what I recollect, hardly any of the students who were mature people were religious. But this subject came up of leadership in marriage, and it was interesting to me to hear the women there in general say that from their point of view, a lot of wives want their husbands to be more decisive, to show more leadership. And I've heard that said by women in the church as well. So, although some may rally against verses 22 to 24, there's a lot of women out there, and I'm not just talking about religious women, who want their wives to show more leadership, to take more initiative, and so forth. But it's not a one-way street. Yes, wives are called to submit by accepting their husband's leadership in various ways, but at the same time, husbands are called to submit by demonstrating self-sacrificial, unselfish love. So thus it is in verse 21 that both sides are submitting to each other. This is mutual, rather than husbands being slave drivers. Let's also have a look down in verse 31. We've already read this once. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And yes, I recognize that this is addressed to husbands, as was the original passage in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25. But what did we see? A husband is to hold fast to his wife. A husband is to be, in a sense, glued to his wife. And if the husband is glued to his wife, then that means the wife is glued to a husband. The wife is devoted to a husband. Going back to my aircraft model building days, it would say glue part A to part B. So I do that. So now part A is glued to part B, but as a result of that, part B is also glued to part A. It works both ways. And so it is that as a husband is devoted to his wife, so the wife should be devoted to her husband. And there should be a binding relationship with them both. And furthermore, this should be something that is not interfered with or dominated by parents. It says a man leaves his father and his mother. Well, the same thing happens to the wife, that she shouldn't be getting her parents or allowing her parents to constantly interfere with the marriage. And this idea of the wife leaving her parents does actually have some biblical support if we go back to Psalm 45 and verse 10. Psalm 45 and verse 10, and this here is talking in the context of a princess marrying the king. Psalm 45 and verse 10, Hear, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. So the idea there, the advice given there to the princess, was that she needed to leave her family and devote herself to the king, just as in Genesis chapter 2 verse 24 and over here in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 31, the husband devotes himself to the wife. Again, it's a two-way process, and so it is all the way through this passage. One other thing to note down in Ephesians 5 and verse 33, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see to it that she respects her husband. You say, well, that doesn't say anything there about a wife loving her husband. It doesn't there, but nevertheless, wives should love their husbands. For instance, we go over to the book of Titus chapter 2, and here older women in the church are to encourage and to teach younger women, among other things, verse 5, to be verse 4, to train the young women to love their husbands and children. So yes, wives do love their husbands. That should be the case. But here it also says the wife should respect her husband. What does the word respect mean? Well, again, we go back to the original word as it meant originally. Thayers says it means to treat with deference. So you think, what does that mean? All right, we go to Macquarie Dictionary. Deference means, number one, submission or yielding to the judgment, opinion, will, etc. of another. Number two, respectful or courteous regard. Barnes' definition of the word, to honour or respect. And what you find is, as you look up various writers, lexicons and so forth, is this idea of a wife respecting a husband is linked back to verses 22 to 24 with the idea of submission. And it should be a willing submission, a respectful submission, rather than a resentful submission or respect. But this does raise again a question. All right, wives are instructed to respect their husbands, to accept their husband's leadership in various ways. But what about us as husbands? Do we make it easier or harder for wives to have any respect for us? Do we demand respect on the basis of this passage rather than deserving respect? So I keep saying it over and over again, it's got to be mutual. Both sides here have to be working at things in the relationship. I don't know whether in the process of going through this, I also read verses 28 and 33 where it talks about husbands loving their wives as their own bodies and husbands loving their wives as themselves. But if I did skip over that, the idea is I should have no less care for my wife than I have for my own needs. So here we have a two-way bond. And coming back to this idea of a wife respecting her husband, you actually do have in all of this a safeguard. Unselfish, self-sacrificial love for his wife on the husband's part will prevent him from taking advantage of his wife's submissiveness and respect. At the same time, respect for her husband on the wife's part will restrict her from taking advantage of her husband's unselfish, self-sacrificial love. Because of the attitude each one has for the other, we don't manipulate one another to our own advantages. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 31 quotes Genesis 2 and verse 24 in saying that in marriage the two become one. Now in one sense that takes place when you get married. You are now one. But in another sense, a deeper oneness takes time. It's going to require adjustment on the part of both husband and wife. It's going to require learning and patience and maturity and forgiveness, because there'll be times when each side struggles to do the right thing. It involves overcoming negative characteristics that we've developed in our younger years and replacing them with positive characteristics. So this idea of oneness is an ongoing goal, if you like, in marriage. But the qualities in Ephesians 5, whilst they don't cover everything, they do provide a solid foundation. Husbands should make it their goal to develop an unselfish, self-sacrificial love for their wives. They should commit themselves to their wives. They should act for the good of their wives. At the same time, wives should make it their goal to accept their husband's leadership, to commit themselves to their husbands, to respect their husbands. And as I said, these mutual qualities act as safeguards, restricting husbands and wives from trying to manipulate one another, to try and take advantage of one another. But there's something you'll notice here from Ephesians 5:21 to verse 33. It's all linked up with Christ and his relationship with his church. And so one of the things for both husbands and wives to consider is, how does this compare with Christ? And how does this compare with Christ's relationship with his church? Am I being like Christ? And again, that rules out husbands being chauvinistic and misogynistic and all of those things. It also rules out wives being tough and rough on their husbands. And that sort of thing does happen. There can be faults on both sides. But what it takes really to help in a marriage is for both parties to be devoted to Christ and to being like Christ and to applying their relationship with Christ to their marriage. In that way, you can better build a marriage as it should be, rather than a marriage that follows the ways of the world. Let's pray. Father, you established marriage just as you established humanity. And Father, you designed it to be for benefit, mutual benefit. Husbands helping wives, wives helping husbands. But in so many cases today, that concept is lost. And it becomes a war and a battleground and leads in many cases to divorce. Father, forgive us as Christians that we allow the views of the world in this matter to encroach upon your will and your teachings. For as Christians, we should have a higher view of marriage and a greater commitment to marriage than those who are not Christians. Help us, Father, to aspire to that by first of all honouring you through Jesus Christ, and then applying that to all of our relationships, including marriage and the home. Help us to be honest with ourselves and to examine ourselves and to see how we can improve, whether we are husbands or wives. Help us to seek your ways. Despite the fact that the world is rejecting your ways are best because you created us and you know us. Help us therefore to trust you and to follow you as we ought, and to do everything we can to build our marriages, to build our families. We pray this through Jesus Christ. Amen. Thanks once again for taking the time to listen. There's an awful lot that could be discussed about this subject. It covers many, many things. And there's a lot of good material that is available in regard to building marriages, and a lot of good material in the Bible itself, and a lot to be learned from older couples too who have spent 30, 40, 50 or more years building marriages with one another. If you want more information, as always, there's our website and the links that will show on the screen here. Take care of yourselves through the week ahead, and I hope to see you again in a week's time. Bye for now.